Hey there, welcome back to my tutorials, my tutorial series on building a Simon game. Okay, so this tutorial we're going to get into putting a model into the game, because right now, as you can see, this is kind of boring. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in a model I made in Blender. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Blender. This is a free open source 3D content creation package. It's much like 3D Studio or Maya in that you can create objects and you can model them and texture them and animate them, and you can bring them right into Unity. Now, I'm not the most knowledgeable Blender person. In fact, Blender is fairly new to me, but I was able to go ahead and create a 3D Simon model with a little bit of time here. This may look kind of complicated, but really what I did here was I took a cylinder and I basically extruded parts of it and scaled other parts. And let's see, hold on, let's go back into object mode here. And with extrusions and scales, I was able to kind of model this base shape. And you can kind of see the wireframe here. It's pretty straightforward, very simple. And I used a modifier here, which I guess got baked in, but there's a modifier called subdivision surfaces, which gives you nice rounded shapes. The one that got baked in clearly wasn't as round as this. Go ahead and turn off that wireframe now. So what was that right there? So you get kind of nice rounded wireframe, or nice rounded mesh. Anyway, so I went through and I made this, and I'll make another tutorial on how I did this shortly, but first I'm going to talk about how I integrated this model. And I saved this out as an FBX. I don't remember exactly how you save in Blender. You can hit spacebar and then it'll basically open up a prompt where you can type whatever you want and it'll search, kind of like on the Mac when you hit command spacebar, it'll open up a prompt. In any case, I went ahead and I brought my model into Unity. So I have a meshes directory I created here in Unity, and I brought my model, and each one of my buttons is a separate model. And then I just dropped my model into Unity. You can see there. There's the model. It's looking kind of interesting. I found a normal map online that I just used to texture the plastic here so that it has kind of non-uniform feel to it. Kind of interesting. And I messed around with the settings on the material. This particular model has two materials on it. Let me hide these buttons, kind of in the way. Anyways, this model has two materials on it. One is for this inner piece. I was looking at a Simon game, and it kind of has a label inside. Some Simon games have some controls, like turning the power on, and I'm not sure, maybe there's a volume switch. Anyway, so you can see, because I gave it two materials in Blender, it came into Unity with two materials, and I'm able to modify those materials. So this is clearly a lot more shiny. It's kind of interesting as well. But the PBR materials in Unity, I think in terms of giving you reflections and lighting effects. So this is something you can play with. I selected the standard specular material for plastic. The other specular, just the standard, has a metal slider on it, so you can give it some metallic kind of feel, which is also interesting. This is a matter of you just kind of playing with the settings and getting something you like. I personally want a kind of soft specular highlight on my plastic. So there we go. It's clearly too close to the camera. So there's the camera on the right. If you take a look, go ahead and pull this back a little bit. I'm going to leave this in the up position here, and I'm going to zero out all of its position settings. Let's see, this is sets to -90 right there. And I'm going to drop an empty game object in here. And I'll just call this model. And I'll drop my Simon case under the model. And then I'll go ahead and drop each button under that model game object. And you can see the buttons are lining up just right, because they're also relative to their 0 position in Blender. So they have the same rotation, they have the same angle, and they have the same pivot point. You can see I put the pivot point here in the middle for all of the objects. So if I take my red button, for example, and I decide to rotate it, I'm really rotating it from the middle. It'll rotate around this center. Sometimes I can get tricky with, let me turn these lights off. I can get tricky with the different models. If you have a model that has an animation on it, like a humanoid, you probably want the pivot point somewhere in the center or down by the bottom of the feet, right in the middle of the feet. So you have to take that into account when you're modeling your models. Again, I'll go through how I set this up in Blender, and this is, you know, a really basic model for a game model. I mean, certainly there are a lot of other things that could be done here. I'm sure I could have spent a lot more time worrying about the wireframes. These buttons are really way too complicated for a game model. But I'm not really worried about going over how to build optimized mesh right now. Just trying to get basics in place here so somebody can get through a full game development process. You can see as an indie game developer, there are a lot of things to worry about. Whether it's modeling, texturing, which is another thing I didn't mention. There in Blender, I went ahead and I added some basic textures. In Unity, you probably have to come back in here and modify these textures because there's never a direct correlation to these materials. The nice thing about it is if you export FBX with textures on the materials, these actually don't have textures, these are just materials with some shaders. So the materials just have the colors set and their kind of properties set up. But if I had a texture, it'd be like an image in the image slot there. So for example, this Simon case actually does have a normal map on it right now. You can see this normal map right here. It's just tiled over the model itself. But yeah, so there's a lot of things to worry about. Textures, mesh optimization, pivot points, how to break up your models. So in this case, we want these buttons to animate when they're hit. So yeah, so I went ahead and I pulled this model into my scene, and I just put it here in front of a camera. You can see this is the game view here, and it's looking kind of nice. I have an extra light in here that I threw in, so I've got kind of this bluish, what I like to think of as a rim light, although it may not be doing too much for the rim. We don't really need the 3D. Actually, let me turn this back on. So this panel here lets you drop down and manipulate the gizmos that are in Unity 3D. Oftentimes those gizmos can either be in the way or maybe you need to modify them so you can see them better. In this case, I just want to see the light, how they're angled. Kind of want to use this. This is actually, I guess, not a rim light, but what would be called a backlight. There's a key, there's a fill, and then there's a rim light. So I guess this is more like a key light. Again, I'm not really a lighting expert either, but it's other things that you need to worry about. Okay, so you can see it's really bright there. Probably don't want it that bright. It's kind of blowing out in some respects, although it is interesting. I have another thing on the camera, which I imported here, this bloom script, which kind of gives it that kind of soft look. You can go into your assets directory, go into import package, select effects, and it'll bring a pop-up. So it'll first say decompressing, and then it'll give you this pop-up, and here it'll list all the assets that it can import. You hit OK, and it imports a bunch of assets. So you can see what it does is it creates this standard assets directory, and here under effects you can see all sorts of different effects. There's a glass refraction effect. These are image effects, which is what I used, an image effect here. There's a bloom script here. There's anti-aliasing, all sorts of things. And there are a lot more directories here that you can take a look at if you want some tune shading. There's just a lot of things going on. So I'll let you explore those at your own pace. But what I did was I added the basic bloom script here, and that gave me the ability to kind of soften things, or sharpen things, or you can go in the negative. I never knew that. That's also really weird, kind of interesting. So I've imported my model. I've aligned my buttons. Thankfully I didn't have to do much. I've rotated it so I have a good view of it from the camera. But my model is not hooked up like my buttons were. So I've actually gone ahead and done this in another game object here. I imported my model just to test this beforehand. But all I did really was I grabbed from my buttons, I grabbed my box collider. Actually, I didn't use the box collider, I used a mesh collider. So what that is that it takes the mesh of your object and creates a collider out of it. So we can see that here. I'll go ahead and hit F, and that should center me on my object. So there's my object. I'm going to go ahead and add a mesh collider. So I'm just hitting that add component button in the inspector while I have my object selected. I type in mesh and mesh collider comes up. And now you can't see this right now. If I turn off the mesh render, you see this green wireframe. So that green wireframe is a mesh collider. It basically takes my mesh wireframe and creates a secondary wireframe out of it, which checks for any collisions. The nice thing about that is with mesh collider you can get really non-uniform shapes. So like this button is kind of a bent rectangle. If I used box colliders, I'd have to either approximate the box over the curve here and beyond the curve out here, so I'd have a much bigger area that could be hit, which may not be a bad thing. Or I'd have to create several boxes to try and get really close to an approximation of this button. So with the mesh collider, I'm able to get the exact shape of my mesh. Now if I optimize my mesh more, then I wouldn't need to have such a dense mesh collider, which there's no reason to have such a dense collider or even a dense mesh for this game. But since there's only 5 models on the screen right now, I don't really think we'll be hitting any polygon limits anywhere. And these things aren't really animated to the point where they'll be taxing a computer. So I'm going to go ahead and add a mesh collider to the other buttons. I just did shift select on these guys, and I did add component, added my mesh collider. Now if I go back to my button, I can see what other things I need. So I had a box collider and a mesh render, which I already have. Mesh render just shows your mesh. Clearly the mesh is visible, so there's a mesh render there. I had this audio source. So I know this is my blue audio source. I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to select copy component. I'm going to find my blue button, and I'm actually going to rename this to, just call it blue button. and I'm going to right click on any other component here and paste component as new, and it'll just paste in my audio source. So I'll go to my green button, I'll do the same, copy component, right click on audio source, copy component. I'm going to grab my green button, I'm going to right click on another component in my green button, hit paste component as new. Red button, once again, same thing. Let's see, this one's the red button. Paste component as new. And red button. And finally, our yellow button. Copy. Let's call that yellow button. And paste component as new. Okay, so we've got our audio clips on every component. Actually, this one, for whatever reason, I was messing with the pitch. Changed it too low. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. So now the next thing I need to do is I need to make sure that my Simon game script knows about my buttons. So I'm going to go ahead and copy my buttons in here. Well, I can't copy my buttons in here because I'm still missing something here. So I'm missing a button script, and I may have moved it off these. If we look back at our old buttons, we have this button script here. It has a button color defined and a button speed, which is 0.1. A couple of things I can do. I can just easily control select all of these guys, add my button script, and I'll just leave it like that. Got my Simon game. Copy blue button in, yellow button. So right now they just have references to different buttons. Green button, red button. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and save that and hit play. And you can see the buttons change colors. And I've got an error here. So Simon also has a reference to the buttons. So I need to I need to drag my buttons into Simon as well. So this is one of the reasons why creating your buttons, making a prefab out of your buttons and creating them dynamically would be helpful. So you could have the Simon game generate the button script on all of the objects and just populate them in Simon, populate them in the game, in the Simon game script, and then connect to any of the buttons it needs. But we'll worry about that some other time. Right now, we just want to get this up and running. So you can see the button color modifies the button of the object. So this is a blue button. I'm going to go ahead and select that color. Get the red one. Go ahead and select the red color. And I'm just selecting a color at random here on the screen. It's not exactly the color I'd chosen the first time, but that's fine. This one looks a little too green. See if I can get it brighter. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, so let's see. So now some interesting things happened here. You can see two buttons just disappeared. They got pressed. If I press this button, we're actually not getting anything. So there's another issue going on here. We were using tags on all our buttons. So let me control select these guys and make sure they're tagged as buttons. So remember, our raycast shoots out into the scene from the camera and it collides with objects, but it checks the tags of the objects it collides with. If they're buttons, then it acts on them. If they're not buttons, then it doesn't do anything. So there, these two buttons disappeared, and you can see the outline over here. They disappeared right into the case of the game. So what's happening here is that the Simon case, ooh, that's interesting. It's like the labels disappeared. Well, what's happening here is that the Simon case is a little higher, and our move script in Lean Tween moves everything to 0. So these buttons move down to 0, and they move below 0 when you press them, and then back up to 0 when you depress them. So if we put them on 0 in the Y, we can move our Simon case up. And that should be that. So there's some weird thing that happened here. This looks like it might be an issue with Unity 5.5. Go ahead and rename these. This is yellow button. This one is the green button. And this one is the red button. Okay, so let's hit save. Let's go ahead and play that. Okay. Okay, another thing I did from the last tutorial was I added this illumination effect where you can see the button illuminates when it gets pressed. So what's happening there is, if you look at the material, there's this emission slot. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the color of the material and I'm putting it into the emission slot, and then I'm pushing the emission slot up. So if I were to take this color here, you can see there's no more shading on it. And as I increase and decrease, you get that shading back. So I'm basically putting the color of the material into the emission slot and then increasing the value of that emission and then decreasing it. And we'll go ahead and take a look at that. The way I did that was I altered the button script. Because the same button script is on all of the buttons, all I had to do was add it to one button script, and it worked over all of the buttons. So the button script has this activate method where it plays its sound, and then it runs this coroutine which changes the color. So I basically set up a method called change object color. And I can run through this line by line here real quick. But what I'm doing is I'm sending in the material by calling get component renderer. So that gets the mesh renderer, and then it gets the material. If you just call material, it gets the main material that's assigned to the mesh renderer, which is right there. It's the first slot. And I'm sending it into this change color object. Now I'm running this as the coroutine that we had before. This also moves the button up and down, but then it lean tweens the color, the emission property of the color of the material. So you can see that it has a button speed. It goes 1.5, well, it goes half as, or it takes twice as long for the button to change colors. Not twice as long, but 1.5 times as long for the button to change colors and then change back, as it does for the button to go up and down. But so lean tween here basically just lets me send anything into a method, and I'm just creating an anonymous method here in the set on update. So I guess this is also called the lambda, where it just creates a value based on color black and the current button color. And then in here I can do whatever I want with that value. So what I'm doing is I'm piping that value back into the emission slot of the material by using the set color property. And I'll get more into modifying materials later on. All you need to know right now is that accessing the set color method of a material lets you modify any of the properties in a material. And there's a really easy way to find what properties you can modify in a material. If you just find a material on any object, you click on the cog and you hit select shader, and you'll see all of these properties here listed are properties that you can modify by calling a set float or a set texture, set well, most of these are floats, but some of them you can set a float, you can set a boolean, you can set whatever you want depending on the material. So go ahead and look at that again. So then the next thing that happens, it waits for a second, which in this case it waits for 1/10 of a second, and then it starts animating everything back. So it animates the button position back up to 0 after it's animated it down to -1. You can make this a little greater. Let's make it a -1.2. Hopefully that's not too much, but we'll test that. And then it lean tween values the emission color back to black. It goes from the button color to black. Okay, so let's see that in action one more time. So maybe we want this to be a little greater here. Kind of looks like we're playing on a car tire or something. Yeah, I still haven't fixed this bug where if you hit the wrong key, then it tries to reset, but you can continue to hit the buttons while it's trying to reset. It throws things off a little bit, and we'll look at that in the next tutorial. I think I'm going a little long here. Okay. So I hope this has been informative. So far, I think what you could take away from this one is how easy it is to bring models into Unity. And hopefully you got a little inspired to download Blender and mess around with that a bit. Blender is a fairly straightforward package. It's not exactly, if you know 3D Studio or Maya, it's not exactly something you can just pop into and use without any help, I don't think. It took me a little bit of poking around the internet to find out how to modify models using subdivision surfaces. But really, it's an interesting package, and I think it's really nice to have something available that's free out there. It has some really great tools that you can use, like it has built-in sculpting, which is something you get with, I don't know if that's available in 3D Studio now, but it's certainly something that is really common with programs like ZBrush, and it's being used more and more these days. Things like ZBrush in video games and in movies and things like that. Anyways, you can see something like this being a really interesting way to model, create kind of organic shapes. I'll go ahead and get out of there. So yeah, so we went over just kind of some basics with Blender, how I created a model. I didn't really give you the specifics. Whenever importing, all you do is drag your model in. It's as easy as, and actually I can go ahead and do that one more time. I'll just create a new directory here. I'll call this mesh. I'll call this Simon mesh. And I'll go ahead and just drag my model in. Or maybe I won't. You know what, I'll do that in another tutorial. Okay, so anyway, let's go ahead and delete that. Then I talked about hooking up the buttons and just transferring all the components over from our old buttons. And really we can probably delete these buttons now. I talked about some lighting, talked about manipulating materials, and then I got us all set up to continue in the next tutorial, where we can start putting together a menu just to play the game, to see a high score, and to I think that's all we need to do, really. So we'll take a look at building a menu next time and getting the Simon game script set up so that you can call it when you're ready after a player has hit the start game button. All right, I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial. Oh, also, please subscribe to this video series or to my YouTube channel, and feel free to comment. Send me any questions or comments, or if you have anything you'd like to see, please post or email me. I'm always happy to help. All right, thank you.